Welcome to Know the Love of Christ.
Welcome back. Last episode, we discussed Mark 15, verses 1 through 20, where the council delivered Jesus over to Pilate, and then Pilate sent him over to Herod, which we find that in Luke 23, not in the Gospel of Mark. And then Herod sent him back to Pilate, who then tried to release Jesus. He wanted to give the Jews an option, give them an out, I guess. But really, as we discussed before, Pilate had an antagonistic relationship with them, and he would do things to irritate the Jews, and he was just kind of a jerk. But they were obviously jerks as well.
Yeah.
And so we see at the end of that passage where the soldiers lead Jesus away and they mock him and they put a crown of thorns on him. And we are about to enter into the crucifixion account. And that's where we ended last episode. So if you will, go ahead and pause here. Read verses 21 through 47. And when you are ready, go ahead and press play. Okay, so today we are in verses 21 through 47. It kicks right off. In verse 21, it says that they compelled a passerby, a Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and mentioned that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry Jesus' cross. And so, of course, that's very interesting. Jesus has just been flogged. These people have put a crown on him and mocked him and been absolutely hateful to him. And not only do they do that, now he's expected to carry these massive beams of wood to his own death.
Yeah.
Which is just another layer of cruelty, which is what we're going to see. Like, as we go through it, we're just going to peel back, as we have been, layer upon layer upon layer of just absolute inhumane treatment, to put it very mildly.
Yes, Jesus was beaten and scourged. But one thing to note that many people, both denominations, some that teach and emphasizes, and Christians believe, is that Jesus fall down here.
I didn't know that. I didn't know people believe that.
Yeah, I grew up Catholic, and there's Stations of the Cross, which you're supposed to observe, or it's in every Catholic church, and they show that Jesus fell down 3 times. And he didn't fall down. None of the Gospels record that he fell down. But it says that Simon of Cyrene was compelled or impressed upon, depending on your version, to carry the cross. According to Josephus, the act of the Romans compelling or impressing upon one to do something, here being to carry the cross for Jesus, was a very distasteful act to the Jews. So basically the Romans were flexing. The very act of making Simon carry the cross aligns with their total disregard and hate toward Jesus and the Jews. Jesus was not too weak to carry the cross. He was the perfect dichotomy of wills. The human side of him felt fear, anxiety, stress, and agony. He carried it because he doesn't want us to receive the punishment of sin that we deserve. Galatians 3:13 reads, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. We deserve the punishment that he went through because of our refusal to submit to his will and trust that he is God in control.
All right, so as we keep going, it says that they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. Skull, not school. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And from the research that I found, this doesn't necessarily mean that it was shaped like a skull. But from what I read, it wasn't at the time of Jesus' death. What I'm thinking is, this was probably a common crucifixion site, which where they put them would be where people would travel and see them. It was meant to be an example because this was meant to be cruel and demeaning and humiliating.
Golgotha is Aramaic, And Luke uses Calvary, which is Latin. That I didn't know. I often wondered why there was two different names.
Yeah.
But that area was on a well-traveled road.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and so people would see it. And even if, because this is the thing I was thinking about, these people are just hateful. And we know the Jews hate him. But like the Gentiles wouldn't have known. But this was, like I said, this was meant to be an execution. It was meant to be just, it's punishment. It's a punishment. And so, I don't know. I guess when you think about when people do criminal acts in our society and how they're treated afterward by people who found out that they did whatever they did. But the Romans don't really care if Jesus was blaspheming. They have literally no thought about that. They would be more, about the threat to the empire. I guess what I'm getting at is like in a well-trafficked area, it's more of an example. It's more of a, hey, don't go committing treason. Don't go doing stupid stuff because this is what's going to happen to you.
And this was Passover time.
Right.
So there were a lot more Jews.
A lot more Jews in town. But also this wine mixed with myrrh, this would have been kind of medicinal from what I could find. This would have been somewhat of a painkiller.
Yes.
Maybe have a little bit of a narcotic effect. And so it would have been to soothe or ease some of the pain, which would seem humane to do, right? But it would just prolong the event because, of course, the more pain you're in, the more your body goes into shock. And if you can ease that, you can prolong something like this.
So it was cruel.
Yeah, it was, it was cruel, which Jesus denied that. Jesus didn't take it, but we see from the account that he died rather quickly for, the circumstance here. A lot of times crucifixions took days and his took hours.
Yeah.
So if this is the third hour, we're starting at like 9:30. And, we talked about this last episode, I believe, like the lack of sleep that Jesus had. I don't know why that resonates so much with me. Maybe because I have small kids and I love sleep. But like, I know I get really emotional when I haven't had sleep and it's so much harder to do things. Of course, that's a human thing, but we know Jesus was human. And so the fact that he's doing all this with very little sleep, and we're starting at 9-ish in the morning, 9 to 9:30 in the morning right now when they're killing him.
He had supper at Simon Judas's father's house the day before. And so, he probably didn't have any sleep at all.
Yeah, and he was in so much agony the night before this that while he was praying, he was literally sweating blood, which you talked about the medical condition there. But to start out with that kind of emotion, the heaviness and the weight of that, no sleep, and to know that you have so much further to go.
The reward for soldiers, like I'm reading verse 24, the reward for soldiers for administering the actual act of crucifixion was the victim's clothing.
Really?
Like the sandals, the robes, whatever they had. Now, the job was usually performed by 4 Roman soldiers, hence the 4 parts in John 19:23. They divided into 4 parts. Also, in this verse, the tunic that was one piece that they cast lots for was very similar to the tunic that only the high priest wore, according to Josephus. I found it absolutely fascinating that Jesus wore this particular tunic on this day. I don't know if he wore it all the time because it wasn't undergarment, but why was this recorded? It's almost as if he's saying, in all your feeble and evil attempts to humiliate and destroy me, I am the high priest. That's Hebrews 5:10. We're told he's the high priest. I always knew that Jesus was in control of the whole event, but always, for some strange reason, ignorantly held on to the belief that maybe he struggled or maybe he was weak, But to me now, to see in the silent declaration of being the high priest, he was in complete and total control the entire time. I mean, to even down to what he's wearing, he's telling them, but they don't see this, But
Yeah.
I'm so quick to say, oh, but they don't see this. And again,
Right.
I wonder if I would.
And we know that Jesus is high priest from Hebrews.
Right.
Right. Hebrews 5:5-10. And that says, so also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but he was appointed by him who said to him, you are my son, today I've begotten you. As he says also in another place, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Verse 7 says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. We have that preserved for us in Scripture, and we can know that. Like you said, it's like, why didn't they see it? But
this whole scene, I don't remember if it was recorded or you and I talked about this, but this whole crucifixion scene is in Psalm 22. This whole dividing of the garments is in Psalm 22. The thirst he craved was in Psalm 22. I mean, everything. Read Psalm 22.
yes,
Please read it. Because I often read that during
the Lord's
communion.
Supper.
Yeah. So, yeah, I highly recommend reading it because there's so much there that helps bring to life too. Because it's written by David, but it's
It's a messianic song.
yeah, and it's from what would be his point of view. He's surrounded by dogs. His mouth is dry and his tongue sticks to his mouth, and it's just interesting to read.
It is. All right. And so as we move on, we see that it gives us the inscription, the King of the Jews, that was written and placed over his head, and that they crucified two robbers on his left and right, and that those who passed by him, which we already mentioned this, derided him, wagging their heads and saying, aha, you who had destroyed the temple and rebuilt it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. And the chief priests and the scribes mocked him.
That too is in Psalm 22, by the way.
And said, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. And those who were crucified with him also reviled him. But there is so much going on there to unpack. The inscription itself, it doesn't tell us here, but it does tell us over in
John 19.
Yes.
And Luke 23.
Yeah. That when Pilate wrote this, the Jewish leaders that were there were like, oh, don't write that. He said, like he claimed to be this person. And Pilate was like, what I've written. Like, it is what it is, which is also probably another jab at the Jews. Like,
yeah, probably.
Sticking it to them. But the irony of him being a Gentile and writing this is just so rich there.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that everyone around him was mocking him. There was not a person that we see in these 7 verses that was on his side or coming to his aid.
Right, because remember, his disciples fled.
Right, his disciples fled. Now, we know from other accounts that his mother was there and John was there.
Later.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you know Latin and Greek, which is what these were written in? Latin and Greek were the main languages of the Roman Empire. There were regional languages spoken too, like we mentioned in John 19 and Luke 23. It says that the charge was written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Pilate, being the Gentile, declared Jesus as King of the Jews to the Roman Empire.
That line in 32, let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe.
Can you just hear the
bitterness, the vitriol, the just, But But just the audacity. And I'm wondering, some of the people that were saying these things may have converted later. Can you imagine saying that and then later
Being cut to the heart.
Yeah, that would have been a deep cut. Very deep cut. He took the old law and pulled the principles out of that and just expounded on them. Like, not only shouldn't you murder your brother, but if you hate him, like, you're basically guilty of murder. And this is just the embodiment of that right there. Like, you hate him enough. Yeah, this is going to naturally follow if you don't check your heart and your attitude. Like, you've got to not only follow the law, you've got to have the right attitude about it. You've got to have the right heart for it. It needs to be an outflowing of the heart. And these are the leaders here, and they don't have the right heart.
It's interesting you mentioned the leaders, because the chief priests and the bros were all there dressed in their garb because the Passover,
And they think they're carrying out their duties.
Right. And so for them to be saying these things, I mean, the weight of this, they're leaders of the Jewish nation. Responsibility they had was to bring people to God.
Mm-hmm.
And
this is literally God in the flesh.
Yes. And yet they're, let the King of Jews get in, you could just hear it. How does that apply to us today? Leaders in the church, leaders in the family, parents. There's just...
And a lot of times we look at things and we say, oh, well, the ends justify the means. And in their minds, like, they were jealous. It says that Pilate perceived that. All right, moving on. So we see here in this same passage, this chunk of scripture, that he was crucified with two robbers. And that word there, lestes, in the Greek, actually could mean rebel or revolutionary, not just robber. And we know that Barabbas was an insurrection or a rebel, revolutionary. And so it is possible, not that it's definite and we don't have it recorded, but these would have been like some of his cohorts, some of the people that were in the insurrection with him. And this could have been the execution meant for him. We knew that he was being held and Pilate offered to release him. And as we talked about that in last episode, that was a custom. I just found that kind of interesting that might be a possibility, that these would have been people that were with Barabbas. And so Jesus, like, it was really a true swapping out of sorts.
Yeah.
Possibly. I say really, truly. It's possibly a really true swapping. And of course, I always geek out over the weird little details.
You know what I just thought of? Okay, so verse 32, it says, this is the Jews crying out, "Let the Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross." They had more confidence and faith in the cross as a weapon of destruction. Like, the irony behind that. Yeah. They had faith in that cross, but to destroy the Christ. We have faith in the cross as salvation. Come down from the cross. Like, you can't come down from that cross. The cross has got you.
And that, I mean, for us, it should have more power than what they believed.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Really, they have more faith in the Messiah. Like the idea of the Messiah.
The belief that one day he'll come, but it's not this one right here.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they did not get it. And we know that was providentially used.
Right.
So, but that last part where it says those who were crucified with him also reviled him. When I was younger, that really used to mess with me, because when you go over to Luke, it talks about one of the ones that were with him reviled him, but the other didn't. And that's in Luke 23, of course, 39 through 43. It says, one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." So he joined in with those around him. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. In the midst of him being killed, he's comforting this criminal next to him and forgiving him. Now I think about that language is so strong where he rebukes the other. And he says, do you not fear God? And I know in my own life sometimes, not that I am reviling Jesus, but that I will sin in the next breath. All right. And so here we come to another time in verse 33. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, Behold, he is calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, Truly this man was the Son of God.
There's so much right there.
There is so much right there.
First, in Matthew 27:51, it said that the earth quaked. Amos 8:9, verses 8 and 9 says, Shall the land not tremble for this, and everyone mourn who dwells in it? All of it shall swell like the river, heave and subside like the river of Egypt. And it shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord, that I will make the sun go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in broad daylight. It could not have been a solar eclipse. For one, it was dark for 3 hours. Solar eclipses, it only lasts 7.5 minutes. And it was always, this I didn't know, I think it was from Josephus, it was always a full moon during Passover. So if it was a full moon, that means the sun was shining on the moon. So it couldn't have blocked the sun. Full moon is when the sun shines on the moon and we see it. So that means we're where we can see the sun shining on the moon. We don't see the sun shining, we see the reflection of the sun.
Off the moon. So the moon couldn't be blocking it for us.
Exactly.
He was up there, how you endure that until you die. The way that the body is positioned, you can't breathe unless you lift yourself. You're making an excited face. Please share what you have.
All right. So I read somewhere recently about the science of the crucifixion. First, to understand, Jesus was young, therefore was physically fit. He endured physical labor. So that means he had strength. He walked for 3 years, so he had stamina, And when one is nailed to the cross, you have to physically push yourself up in order to exhale. So to speak, you're exhaling. He spoke 7 times on the cross. So he pushed himself up, excruciating pain, But what's more incredible is that one of those times that he spoke, one of those excruciating moments that he had to lift himself up to stop himself from smothering, he said, forgive them. I was blown away when I realized that, because I didn't know the pushing up in order to speak.
Yeah.
So when he pushed up, he told John, behold your mother, woman, behold your son. He pushed up again to speak, forgive them. He pushed up again, you'll be with me today in paradise. Every one of those pushing ups was intentional and for other people, not himself.
Yeah. But not only the physicality of it, but when you're in that amount of pain, to be able to mentally focus enough to talk. Like you think about, we both had children, like when you're in labor, which is nothing compared to this. I know, like when you're in labor and those pains come, those contractions come. Like I remember we were in Lama's class and they told Rick, like, do not ask her any questions. You anticipate her needs because she will not be able to talk to you. Like her brain is just not going to be able to handle that. don't put any unnecessary strain on her.
Mhm.
And thinking, like, applying that here, like, the fact that he was able to have that mental clarity and to be able, because, I mean, the pain would have been so agonizing. You were just looking for physical relief, but to be able to formulate thoughts and have a conversation and say things coherently, I consider it a blessing that we cannot hear him saying these things, because that would be haunting. Past the fact, to be able to hear him in his voice and to hear the pain. I mean, can you imagine when she's there later, Mary, having to endure that? Like, I can't.
The strength, the physical strength.
And the emotional and mental strength.
Yes, but the strength to push yourself up, and you know it was not very loud, because in comparison, when it says he cried out with a loud voice, that was it. That was the final thing. Everything else had to have been strained, and because when you have a cold, your throat's sore and you just can't talk.
And the overwhelming amount of love there. Okay. Now that I'm an emotional wreck. What I find really interesting is verse 38, where it talks about the curtain of the temple being torn in two from top to bottom. The imagery there. And I, as a child, we discussed it in Bible class about, oh, well, nobody could reach that high. And they never really went any further, but it's very significant here. It's like God is taking the old covenant, the old law, and which is a contract. It's a covenant with his people, and he's ripping it in half. And Jesus, when he died, he didn't abolish the old law. He fulfilled it. We find that in Matthew 5:17 through 19. He says that I didn't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. And so for the Jews, this would have been significant. There would have been all these signs. We talked about the darkness before, and we talked about the earthquake from Matthew being mentioned. And so to them, these would have been signs. Darkness was a sign of judgment. This should have been a sign to them, but it's funny because the Gentile here is the one that notices that. But also something interesting, with that being torn in two and that contract being ripped up, it's like God is saying, I'm available to everyone now. It's not just the Jews. Talking about the temple, because this happened in the temple. That this was the Passover and Jesus was the Passover lamb. The Passover lamb had to be killed outside the temple. And so, I mean, it just kind of all meshes together, and I'm sorry if it's confusing. I don't find it confusing, but maybe I'm not explaining it well.
It's interesting that it's a Gentile, a Roman soldier, centurion, because
that sees it and thinks.
He was, remember, another centurion was complimented on his faith once before. We talked about that in a previous episode.
We did. Oh, the Gentiles here are just bringing all the irony.
Yep.
All right, for time's sake, we're going to stop there, and we will pick up in verse 42 through the end of chapter 16 and finish Mark in the next episode. But we need to ask our very important question: where do we see the love of Christ? In verses 21 through 41. Which we didn't even, let's go ahead really quick. I'm just going to read 40 and 41 because we didn't even discuss it. There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Which sadly, we don't have the time to discuss that. But if you guys have any thoughts on that, we would love to hear them, because of course, that's recorded for us and is significant there. But where do we see the love of Christ?
I see it in verse 34 when he screams out in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which translates, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because at this point, he felt completely abandoned. The human side of him is feeling this complete agony, the pain of abandonment, the pain of being alone, the physical pain of being mutilated. And he's crying out to his Father. He's just completely alone. And I can't help but to think that if we're not faithful to him, that's our cry in hell. Like, that is hell. That's complete separation from God. Although it is for a mere moment. Isaiah 54:7 says, "For a mere moment I have forsaken you, but with great mercies I will gather you." So even though it was for a mere moment, there was total separation from God. A mere moment as far as, the span of history goes. But I think that's the most excruciating part of his sufferings. And he did it for me.
I see it in verse 30. Well, really that whole section, 27 through 32, where they're mocking him. But in verse 30, it says, "Save yourself and come down from the cross." And the fact that he didn't, the fact that he stayed there, because he very well could have saved himself, but he could not save himself and me. And so he conscientiously chose me. He chose each of us individually to do that for every single person that ever existed in all of history, because he didn't just die for those who will come to him. He died for everyone. Now, we don't get the blessings of salvation without coming to him and doing his will. But just the fact that he did that willingly for everybody and chose not to, while they mocked him for not doing it.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. It's a somber day. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. We would love to study with you if you're local, and if not, we could connect you to someone who's local to you. As always, we hope that you will see. You can reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram. We would love to hear from you. And be sure to click like and share this episode with family and friends. In doing so, you're sharing the love of Christ.